Things don't look great for the journalism business. This week, Alden Global Capital Unit Digital First Media made a hostile bid for Gannett, publisher of USA Today and other newspapers. So why is that a big deal? Well, as a journalist myself, one who started in newspapers, I'm all for profits. But Digital First has a reputation for gutting newsrooms, wringing the profits out of them and leaving them a shell of their former selves. Digital First doesn't have a great record of investing in innovation along the way either. And USA Today, well, it circulates 1 million newspapers a day, ranking it one of the top U.S. papers along with the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. It's one thing if local and regional papers are getting taken out by raiders, but this is a new marker. Tech has changed the news business, and it still is. The internet upended the old advertising and distribution models, and meanwhile, the whole idea of a strong press as a check on the powerful, that's up in the air too. This is Fortt Knox, Rich Ideas and Powerful People. I am Jon Fortt from CNBC at the NASDAQ market site overlooking Times Square. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Is a new business model for journalism emerging? To help me probe that question this week, I've got two of the very best. Jim Stewart is a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper man, a New York Times columnist, a Loeb Award-winning author, and I could go on, but we'd both get embarrassed. Walter Isaacson is former CEO of CNN, former editor of Time magazine, and until recently head of the Aspen Institute. He's the biographer of no lesser lights than Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, and Leonardo da Vinci, and I could go on, or we both get embarrassed. Guys, thanks for being with me. Sure. No better couple of people to talk to about this. Jim, you've seen a lot in the journalism business. So first I want to start out with where we are. Things looked really bad for the New York Times. It maybe actually was seeming to fail back about 10 years ago. January 2009, it hit a low. But it's been climbing since then, kind of having found a digital business model, not just in advertising, but people are paying for subscriptions. How is that storyline kind of changing the way we look at journalism?
Well, you know, it's been an incredible change. I think one of the biggest, certainly from a business perspective, is that newspapers, media generally, have been going from an advertiser-supported economic model to a subscriber-supported model. I don't think people realized when they would pay, you know, their $2 or something for the New York Times that the cost of that paper was probably something like $6 or $8, and all the rest of that was paid by advertising. The advertising has plunged. What the Times and other publishers have had to do is find alternative revenue sources, and the main one has been from subscribers. Now, there is something good in that. I mean, I think people were always concerned that advertisers called the shots at many publications, if not overtly, then covertly. That's where the money was coming from. They had influence. You know, the Times, the Wall Street Journal prided themselves on their independence from advertisers. They would let advertisers cancel rather than change a story in famous instances. But nevertheless, subscriber support in many ways is a pure economic way to protect journalistic integrity. The question is, how much money is there?
Right. And Walter, the Washington Post similarly has been reinventing itself. Jeff Bezos took it over some years ago, saying he wasn't doing it as philanthropy. He wanted this to be a business. It seems to be bearing out. They've also got a pretty good subscriber story. Where does that fit in? And I guess there are only so many Jeff Bezoses out there. One.
Yes. Well, first of all, what Jeff Bezos has shown is that people like Digital First who come in and say we're going to succeed by cutting, it never works. It's people who invest in new ways of doing business. People invest in digital technology, having a quicker website. So you see the Washington Post and the New York Times both starting to succeed in growing subscriber base. I just read Jill Abramson's great book that comes out in a couple of months, The Merchants of Truth, and she explains how it was somewhat surprising that both Bezos and Arthur Sulzberger are the ones who figure out subscription revenue. But let me add to what Jim said. I think that you can't just have two revenue streams, meaning advertising, and then hope to get some from subscriptions. I think we're going to have to add to the business model because people are not going to subscribe to dozens of different newspapers. I think we have to have what I used to call the newsstand model, which is if you want a particular copy or a particular story on a particular day, you can pay 25 cents or 50 cents. We still haven't gotten that revenue stream, which I think is important.
But Jim, does that work for news? Because if I'm the New York Times and I can get somebody to just pay me for my publication, why would I want to go into some Netflix-like model where they're paying some overlord a monthly fee and I just get a piece of that sometimes and I have to trust them to give me my right metered rate?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern about who these overlords are and how much power they would get, particularly when you look at something like a Netflix or a Facebook, who already have enormous power. I know at most independent media organizations, there's been tremendous reluctance to move in that direction, and I think that's true. At the same time, now it's such a different world. I write a column for the New York Times. We get data, if we want to see it, about who's reading it, where they've come from. And to my amazement, something like only maybe 25% to a third of the readers of my column actually come through the New York Times website. It's
a third at most?
Well, sometimes at most, yeah. And that means like 65, 70% of the readers are getting it through some other source, like somebody, recommends it, or somebody on Facebook spreads it around, or Facebook itself will sometimes, pick out certain stories. Other, they put things together, will cite it. The Drudge Report will put it up. And then you get a big surge of traffic they're coming in kind of sideways. But the New York Times is still getting those impressions and can monetize that with their advertisers.
Walter, when you look at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, these are big publications that have sort of become national. Look at Time Magazine. Mark Benioff, the founder of Salesforce, recently bought that. But there arguably aren't enough buyers for every local newspaper that is holding local and state government accountable, covering school board meetings, et cetera, et cetera. What happens to those if you've got to expect people to subscribe and some maybe national advertising base to rise up? That money's not there for them anymore, is it?
No, I think that's one of my biggest worries. I'm down here in New Orleans. And amazingly enough, we have two newspapers in New Orleans. It's sort of an anomaly, but we have the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans Advocate still competing, but that's pretty unsustainable. The important things about having local media in a market like this is just take the normal things that affect our lives. I'm on the City Planning Commission here in New Orleans. We're debating about Airbnb and short-term rentals. We're trying to get the balance right. This is things that affect every single neighborhood. We need to make sure that there's newspapers and TV stations, local reporters who open up that process, let people get involved. It's not just for major investigative pieces, it's for that day in and day out planning stuff that localities and school boards have to have, that we need local media. And once again, I go back to this question. I know it's hard to consolidate under Facebook or others, Amazon controlling your payment system. But if we could just have a way where people could have direct payments for a story like Jim said, they come in sideways through an aggregator, they say Jim's column, maybe they should somehow or another be able to pay a dime for it, even if it's just a digital wallet or a digital cryptocurrency that's part of your browser. Right. It says whenever I go to a site, they get a tiny bit of money, just like every time a song gets played on the radio. The artist gets a little bit of money.
Once again, this is Fortt Knox, and we are talking about the future of journalism. I don't talk about this often, but I used to be a local newspaper guy myself, interned throughout college, the Lexington Herald-Leader, Myrtle Beach Sun News, went to work for the Lexington Herald-Leader in Kentucky after school, went to work for the San Jose Mercury News, which is now owned by Digital First, I should mention, and still have a number of former colleagues and friends working there now. Not only did I report on business, for a while I was an education reporter covering the Eastside Union High School District. Used to go to school board meetings late at night. People wouldn't know what was happening at those meetings unless there was a reporter there. And I remember one story, I figured out that the superintendent was trying to do a bond deal that was illegal, right? And it was the newspaper that pointed out that this was illegal. Jim, without reporters sort of minding the wall in cases like that, we end up with governments doing all kinds of things. Is there a way? Yeah. Is there a way to get local people to pay enough model-wise to support that? Is that something people are even going to be interested in?
Well, I worry what it is going to take to jolt people into realizing what an important function this is and how valuable it is and how it is worth paying for. I think as a practicing journalist, what a lot of people don't realize is how expensive quality journalism is. And I don't care if it's at the international, the national, the local level. Good reporting takes time. It takes educated people. It costs a lot of money. And somebody's got to pay for that if we're going to have it. If we don't have that, look, there's a lot of information sloshing around out there that people want to get into the publications. There are sophisticated PR networks that I've seen become ever more sophisticated, frankly, as they've hired a lot of journalists at much higher pay to go to them. They are creating the stories, they are feeding the stories and giving it to publications who don't have the personnel to really vet this. And so what we're starting to get more and more is what the powerful want you to consume. This is a very worrisome trend to me, and one that I think good journalism stands in the way of that at every level of government, business, and society.
How much hope, Jim, should we take?
Can I interject something?
Go ahead, Walter.
Can I interject? Just something on what you just said, because that's real important, John. You grew up working for newspapers. You got trained. I grew up here in New Orleans. I was just like a 20-year-old, and I got trained in how to report a story, how to go out late at night and be at the school board meeting and get the facts and the spelling right. And this was the training ground, the apprentice program. This is why, John, you're a good journalist. And, you know, Jim Stewart, myself, we were both acolytes of Norman Pearlstein, now the editor of the LA Times. We got trained, whether it was at Time Incorporated, the Wall Street Journal, the Lexington paper. That's another thing that's getting decimated now. People are not being trained in how to be real journalists.
Yeah. Jim, I wonder. I look at something like The Athletic, which is this startup in journalism, specifically sports journalism, that's gone out and hired a lot of the best local sports journalists around the country with this subscription model, saying, hey, people, you want to know what's going on with your team? Subscribe to The Athletic. We've got great in-depth coverage. It appears to be working. Can that work for many of the important things that we used to find in a newspaper, or just some of them? Like, is it possible to have the academic, like a version of The Athletic that reports on education and covers school boards around the country? Not as sexy as sports. You think people will pay for it?
It's possible. I mean, I have heard a lot of talk about the fact that the general interest publication, as we used to call them, Time Magazine, the Times, is an endangered species because there are specialized now publications that can just devote themselves for like sports or say the arts or politics in a way that will attract people who are interested in that and will go deeper than any general interest publication ever could do. And there may be markets for that. So much to my surprise, though, I haven't seen a whole lot of this. And there were a lot of these startup digital things that created a lot of excitement in the beginning, you know, BuzzFeed, Vice, Business Insider, all this kind of thing. And you know, they're still doing good work, but I don't see them taking over from, you know, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times.
Traditional media, right? I think very quickly they start to get kind of gray, and the question is, do they really have that much growth? Are they that much different, or are they going to start doing cuts too? Well, and I think partly it's because what people want, and I hope it's what they want, is they want real reporting. They don't want just, you know, an agglomeration of what other people have said or commentary spins on it. They want the original. They want the old-fashioned, going to the school board, shoe leather. By the way, I got my start at the Quincy Herald Whig. That's spelled W-H-I-G, which shows you how far back that went. And I covered tornadoes in Northeast Missouri. So they want real reporting, and I think that's where I'm starting to see that some of the old, you know, given up practically for dead traditional media starting to do pretty well because they do deliver that. And I think as the dust is settling, people are willing to pay for it, and they're recognizing the value of that original content. And this is what reporters do, right, Walter? We talk about our earliest assignments and just how gritty they were and obscure the names of the publications were. It's our way of kind of notching things off, right?
I think talking about the Picayune doing hurricanes is almost as good as talking about the Whig doing tornadoes.
So, Walter, give us some history. I mean, I know you wrote the biography, literally wrote the book on Ben Franklin, so you can give some insight. We haven't always had these strong journalistic institutions that had a ways to fall or that even professed any level of objectivity. How old is the model that we are maybe losing, at least at the local level, and how quickly do these things turn over? Is there any sense, one generation, two, on how long it might take to find another model and when something like this has happened before?
This is a very good question because we shouldn't get all nostalgic about the great golden age of journalism. Throughout most of American history, you had lots of competing newspapers. Ben Franklin, as a young runaway from his brother's newspaper in Boston, arrives in Philadelphia, which has 10 newspapers, and he starts an 11th newspaper. They tend to be rather partisan. Some were on the side of the proprietors or the Anglicans or the Crowns or the working class. That was a raucous form of journalism. It was only after World War II that the advent of broadcast networks, which you couldn't just be a Ben Franklin and start a broadcast network, there were only 3 or 4 of them that could run, monopolization of newspapers, because newspapers consolidated as department stores decided they didn't want to advertise in 11 different newspapers. All that sort of created a broad mass media that tried to reach a large audience. Whether you were the local newspaper, you tried to appeal to everybody. Whether you were the CBS Evening News, you said that's the way it is, to a broad-based appeal. Now there's something good about the fact that that model has gone away and that you have hundreds of voices in the blogosphere and on talk radio and on cable TV. That opens up the discussion. The problem is we've yet to find the new business model that will support journalism in that.
And
so I
Ben
think the
Franklin,
problem with these vultures.
Yeah, like you said, Ben Franklin didn't have a staff of hundreds. He was more like a blogger, right? I mean, he was basically...
And an aggregator.
Yeah, and an aggregator. And then...
He was a blogger and an aggregator, but yeah.
As things matured, there was this wave of consolidation, and I guess the rise of strong local, regional, and especially national retail put kind of an economic floor and advertising base on that. It was mostly subscription during his time, right?
Well, during Ben Franklin's time, it was back to my old model of you paid per copy. You paid
no
your Picayune, which is what the Times Picayune was about, which was a tiny coin, or you paid a little coin for the paper. Then there was a subscription model. You're right. When you got into the 1940s and 50s, it was much more subscription-based, but the bulk of the revenue came from display advertising. The Macy's and the Saks, and here in New Orleans, the Maison Blanche and the Gauchos, they'd take out the big ads, and they would want newspapers that weren't highly partisan. They would want newspapers that people trusted, and so that led to sort of a quality, but also a bit of a blandness in journalism.
And Jim, that brings us back to data. Right? The reason why those advertisers wanted that audience is because I assume they thought it would be broad. There was trust involved. They believed it would be consistent and that if they put their ad next to that copy, people would believe in it. As we're going through all of this controversy over data in social media, platforms like Facebook, Google, et cetera, are there echoes of that bygone era that we might be going through as that settles out, maybe a new revenue model emerges?
Well, there is an advertising revolution that's gone on that's, remarkable in my lifetime, and that is that, the old model where you would have a general interest newspaper or a broadcast network, you'd put an ad in there and wonder like who read it and what effect it had. I mean, there was never any scientific way to measure that exactly. Now the technology exists that if you're reading online and you're reading about a certain subject in a certain publication, the advertisers, they can, and I'm sure you've experienced it, you have recently looked at like a new washing machine or something, and suddenly you're reading something and you start getting these ads for washing machines.
Retargeting, that's right.
I mean, this is incredibly efficient and effective advertising. And to my mind, at least in theory, that is so much more valuable to an advertiser in terms of the impact it can have on consumer behavior that it should lead to their willingness to pay a higher rate. Now, the question is, who's competing for that money, and to what extent is the competition holding down the price of that? In that sense, this has been an amazing boon for advertisers. I mean, Google, who can like place ads to the word you're searching for, that's an amazingly efficient and effective way of displaying advertising. And Google is making tons of money on that. I think traditional media hasn't refined it to that degree and hasn't gotten there, but I'm kind of mildly optimistic that at some point it's going to be so efficient and effective that they will be able to charge a premium for that.
This is Fortt Knox. We are talking future of journalism. Is there a business model out there in the age of the internet? Walter, it strikes me that we're talking about the efficiency of Google, search word-based advertising, Facebook, personally targeted advertising, but at the same time, these two companies that have two supposedly of the perfect business models are now investing in content to sustain people's attention. Are they creeping back into realizing or perhaps embracing the idea that you do need longer form content, things that people trust, things that they need to look at every day in order to really engage the audience? And might we end up through that with a new model for journalism?
Well, as Hemingway says at the end of The Sun Also Rises, wouldn't it be pretty to think so? But I don't think so. I don't think that's what Google is doing. I don't think that's what Facebook is doing. I think the real problem is that 80% of the advertising dollars we've talked about goes to places like Google and Facebook, which aggregate all of your data, know that you care about washing machines or you haven't changed your tires on your car or whatever. And so I think the other type of business model we have to break is that the producers of the content, the people at the Times-Picayune or the New Orleans Advocate who send people to the school board to cover the meetings, they're the ones who have to get some of that revenue. And one model that I don't think could happen, but I hope could, is that all the purveyors of content could go to the aggregators, go to the Googles, go to the Facebooks, and say, if you want to serve up the content we've reported, you got to give us a cut of the revenue.
Why won't it happen, Walter? Is it just because they're natural competitors and never get together and agree on anything?
Well, I think one reason is that Facebook and Google have almost monopolies in their particular area. But the thousands of journalistic organizations are very fractured. And weirdly enough, our antitrust law keeps newspapers and journalistic outlets from consorting together and trying to make a deal with an Apple or a Facebook and a Google. But the antitrust laws don't push back when a Google buys, certain things so that in Google Maps they'll have their own restaurant reviews and you don't need to go to the local newspaper to get restaurant reviews.
Jim, we haven't talked a lot about TV. That's in part, and here's part of my bias as a former newspaper man, coming out largely, not in every case, when it comes to general interest, newspapers, magazines do a lot more reporting than TV does. TV, CNBC excluded, we do our own interviews and dig it. A lot of times they're repeating just what other publications have said. So as we look at the future and the combining of different media and how this is going to shake out, any sense of how much progress we've had since 1998, 20 years or so ago, when this really started to hit the fan?
Well, I think you're right that aggregating is not new, that what would show up on the nightly news was often picked from some other news source. I think it would be interesting even today to see a real sophisticated analysis of where the facts, quote unquote, have actually come from, because it's probably from surprisingly few sources. So that isn't new, and I think it's because that's cheap. It's much easier to just pick up what somebody else is saying and repeat it than to do the original work yourself. that goes back to where are the financial incentives for the original work. And that's where I think we need educated and discerning consumers who, one way or another, are willing to pay for it. And to just, again, mention the billionaire model, people who are willing to step in and fund this with no particular profit motive in mind as some kind of public service. I'm thrilled with what's going on in some of these places in the moment, but I don't think that is long-term going to be a viable solution to this.
Only so many billionaires, guys. Though, I mean, with all of this income inequality, I guess more and more of them all the time. Mixed results there. Walter Isaacson, give us the final word.
Well, especially if you want to save local news, I think you have to worry about having more than just the let's trust the local billionaire model. I'm all for billionaires coming in and doing good, much more than vulture firms and venture capital firms that are going to decimate. But I do think we need to find a way for the ordinary consumer who really values high information to have a frictionless, direct way to pay people who are producing that content.
Sounds like something good for startups to continue working on. You know, Apple has their horse in that race. Walter Isaacson, Jim Stewart, thanks so much for sitting down, talking this through. This has been Fortt Knox, Rich Ideas and Powerful People, live from the New York, I shouldn't say New York Stock Exchange, this is the NASDAQ market site overlooking Times Square. Great to have you with us. See you next time.